Thank you for that most generous introduction. I am delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted to be here as the guest of Readex. And before anything else, let me deliver the commercial announcement, which I am not required to deliver, and so this is from the heart. I am the editor of the Papers of Andrew Jackson, and Papers of Andrew Jackson is a project to collect and publish all of Jackson's extant literary record, everything that he wrote and everything that was written to him. So we deal at my shop with primary sources, primary documents. That's what we live by. And as the editor, and even before I was the editor, all the way going back to when I was a graduate student, I immersed myself in primary sources, and that means that Readex and I have had a very beneficial relationship for me, going back decades, back to the days of microprint and the old machines. And we use Readex databases every day, literally. The early American newspapers, there's a great new territorial papers database that I'm sure we're going to buy as soon as it comes out. If you want you and your students and your colleagues to have the opportunity to use primary sources, Readex has a bountiful assortment of them. And I could not give you this talk today without the use of them. Well, Andrew Jackson's reputation has undergone some remarkable somersaults over the years. Once upon a time, scholars and citizens alike acclaimed him as the hero of New Orleans, the avatar of democracy, the defender of the Union, the point man of manifest destiny, and the champion of the working class. And while Jackson has always had detractors, many of them well-armed with strong evidence and good argument, each of these identities seemed to most people to be admirable ones. Jackson was one of those Americans who teachers told their students to be proud of and to look up to. One of our great presidents. After all, it's only great people that we do this for. Only he's coming off. Only maybe he's not coming off. Well, all that has changed now, as you know. Today, many Americans know a very different Andrew Jackson, not the champion of democracy, but the slave owner, and especially the architect of Indian removal and Indian dispossession. And our textbooks reflect this in their allocation of space. Far more students and other Americans today recognize the Trail of Tears than have heard of the bank veto or the Nullification Proclamation, or maybe even the Battle of New Orleans. Well, this generational shift in our perception of Jackson is so complete that it's difficult even for historians to realize just how recent it is. Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s The Age of Jackson, which was published in 1945 and is still the foundational work for modern Jacksonian scholarship, famously, in 523 pages of text, devoted 2 sentences, count them, to the subject of Indian affairs. And even at that, those 2 sentences didn't discuss Indian removal at all. They merely brought up the Supreme Court's Worcester versus Georgia case that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, in a chapter titled Jacksonian Democracy and Religion, about Chief John Ross and the Cherokees, about the Treaty of New Echota, about the Trail of Tears. Schlesinger said in The Age of Jackson, nothing whatever. Now, Schlesinger, I should quickly add, was no racist. And though he did admire Jackson, he wasn't deliberately suppressing an unpleasant subject in order to make his man look good. Indian removal simply didn't seem that important to him, and in truth, to most of his readers, in 1945, and it didn't fit well into his story. For Schlesinger, it was an anomaly, an outlier, a sideshow, and so he simply left it out. By the way, growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, there was maybe a paragraph on Indian removal, maybe a paragraph in my textbooks. Well, no historian or biographer would dare to do that today, and Schlesinger, to be fair, long before he died in 2007, publicly regretted doing it in 1945. That is, just leaving Indian removal out. But today, Indian removal has become, for many of us, again, the primary lens through which we view Jackson. And in our textbooks, where it takes up a lot of space today, the story is usually told as a fairly simple morality tale, and it goes something like this. And what I'm going to do now is just quickly summarize the story you usually see in the textbooks. At the time Jackson became president in 1829, the Cherokees and other Indians were occupying their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi, which the United States had guaranteed to them in perpetuity through solemn treaties. By the way, that part of the textbook story is absolutely true. But white people wanted those lands for themselves. As the textbooks will tell you, the discovery of gold on Cherokee land in Georgia triggered a stampede of whites onto Indian land. The Indians appealed to the Supreme Court, which in the case of Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, upheld their right to stay where they were and to govern themselves. But Jackson, who everybody knows, was an Indian fighter and Indian hater from way back, defied the Supreme Court, saying, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And so, left without recourse and with their lands being overrun by white intruders backed by state authority, a small, unauthorized minority of the Cherokees signed a treaty, the Treaty of New Echota, in 1835, calling for their removal to present-day Oklahoma. And then when the vast majority of Cherokees, including the legitimate leaders of their government, refused to submit to this fraud, they were rounded up and removed by military force. This, the forced Cherokee removal in 1838, one on which many hundreds of people died, and historians are still arguing about how many hundreds, was the infamous Trail of Tears, though out among out among the general population, the phrase Trail of Tears has kind of expanded to include not only the forced removal of the Cherokees in 1838, but all of the Jacksonian-era Indian removals. All right, that's the standard story, the one that everyone thinks they know in a nutshell. And although the 1838 deportation was actually conducted under President Martin Van Buren, because Jackson wasn't president anymore, Van Buren was Jackson's hand-picked successor, and in fact, the removal was clearly the fruit of Jackson's policy. Now, there's no question that Jackson is the central villain in this story, and I'm not saying that he shouldn't be. As the editor of Jackson's papers, as a Jackson scholar, it is not my business to defend Andrew Jackson. I don't think I would want to, even if I was supposed to. I'm not here to give a special brief for Andrew Jackson, but I will say that, as often happens, this standard school book version of the story sacrifices some historical accuracy for moral clarity. In offering up a tale of transparent right and wrong, it obscures the true depths and difficulty of the problem. And in offering up an easy villain to blame, it allows the other actors in the drama, historical and living, perhaps even you and me, to escape taking their or our share of the responsibility. If it's all Jackson's fault, then the rest of us get off scot-free. So I'm going to go back now and complicate this story, mess it all up with some inconvenient facts, not alternative facts, real facts, and then try to take some stock at the end of where this complicating leaves us. The first and most obvious complication is this: Indian removal didn't begin with Andrew Jackson. White people, or Europeans, had been wresting land from Indians and pushing them out of the way, generally westward, since they first landed on American shores. And indeed, as Jackson himself pointed out, the result, and sometimes the avowed aim, of Indian policy among some early Americans had been not removal but extermination. Back in New England, of all places. If you're familiar with King Philip's War from the 17th century, it became an exterminationist war. Just kill them all. Well, at the same time as white Americans had been pushing Indians out of their way or simply killing them, they had also, right from the beginning, mounted efforts to Christianize and, in their words, civilize them, to assimilate them into white society, perhaps to the point where Indians would literally meld into that society and cease to exist as separate people. The leaders of these civilizing attempts, by the way, this was Thomas Jefferson's idea, is that we'll just absorb them into us. The leaders of these civilizing attempts, many of them Christian ministers, claim to be, and no doubt were, driven by the highest motives of charity and benevolence. But seen from today, they can appear just as arrogant and condescending as the outright Indian haters. As the so-called civilizers saw it, the greatest favor they could do for the Indians would be to strip off everything that made them Indian. Their religion, their customs and folkways, their family and clan and tribal organization, their language, and replace them with their own, turn them basically into white people. They called this progress, or rather they called this program civilization. Today we might call it cultural genocide. Well, these two impulses, to thrust Indians out of the way or to absorb them in, had coincided and competed right from the beginning. And indeed, though they seem contradictory, they had often gone hand in hand, because experience seemed to show that when Indians encountered white society up close, their own society, instead of simply merging into white society, instead fell apart. So the obvious solution, as it seemed to many whites, was to remove the Indians out of harm's way, to quarantine them somewhere where they would have time to acquire the benefits of Euro-American culture while safely screened off from its vices. Now, another simple solution, of course, would have been simply to leave the Indians alone where they were and stop the encroachments of Euro-Americans that kept bringing the two into close quarters. That solution, though we might think today that it would have been the correct solution, was never seriously advocated by any white person of importance that I have ever encountered. So Andrew Jackson didn't originate the idea of Indian removal. He wasn't even the first president to proclaim it as national policy. In 1825, President James Monroe, two presidents before Jackson, and who, unlike Jackson, had never fought Indians and has never been accused of simply hating them. In 1825, James Monroe told Congress, and these are Monroe's words, that the removal of the Indians from the lands which they now occupy is of very high importance to our Union and may be accomplished on conditions and in a manner to promote the interest and happiness of those tribes. In other words, it'll be good for them if they remove. And for that very reason, Monroe said, and he wasn't merely looking forward, he didn't say we ought to adopt this policy. Monroe said, this is in 1825, again, two presidents before Jackson. Monroe said, for that reason, the government has already been long pursuing this policy. Still, while it is true that Indian removal was already settled policy long before Jackson became president, it is true that he brought a new urgency to the issue. And of this, there can be no question. Previous presidents, including Monroe and the guy in between Monroe and Jackson, that's John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, had addressed Indian relations only when the issue was thrust upon them. They didn't go looking for it. They didn't make it a priority. They simply acted on it when they were compelled to, not Andrew Jackson. When Jackson came to the White House, his views on many matters, including those that came to define his presidency, were still in flux. On big economic issues like the protective tariff and federal transportation projects, known in those days as internal improvements, or even the Bank of the United States, which became the signature issue of his presidency, Jackson, when he came into office in 1829, had so far taken either no position at all or else taken a tentative position, which he would soon reverse. He wasn't dug in on any of those things, but he was dug in on Indian removal. Jackson's first definite presidential pronouncement on any issue of national policy was an address or a so-called talk to the Creek Indians, urging them to remove, they were mainly in Alabama at this time, urging them to remove west of the Mississippi. It was issued on March 23rd, 1829. Jackson had been inaugurated on March 4th, 1829, so he'd been president less than 3 weeks. His administration had barely begun. Martin Van Buren, his Secretary of State, and who would become his right-hand man and presidential successor, hadn't even reached town yet. And yet this talk to the Creeks presented Jackson's removal policy fully formed, so much so that all that followed flowed directly from it. Indian removal was quite literally the first thing on Jackson's policy agenda. The federal government administered its Indian policy, interestingly, through the War Department. There was no Interior Department in those days. Through the War Department, and Jackson chose his secretaries of war. First, John Henry Eaton, and after him, Lewis Cass. Not for their knowledge of military matters and the Army, but because of their enthusiasm for Indian removal. That was their main job as Secretary of War. Let the commanding general of the Army run the Army. You, as Secretary of War, are in charge of Indian removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, which I'll come back to, which authorized the president to treat with the Eastern Indians for their removal west of the Mississippi, was the only major piece of legislation passed by Congress at Jackson's direct behest during his entire presidency, which is itself interesting because Jackson is usually listed among those strong presidents. And we think of strong presidents, we think of usually one of two things: either presidents who were president during a major war, or else presidents who put through a major program. If you look at Jackson's legislative program, it's the internal improvement veto and the distribution veto and the Bank of the United States veto, 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 veto. If you look at his, you might say, positive accomplishments, things that Congress did because Jackson wanted them to, it's Indian removal, period. And Jackson, after that Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, regarded Indian removal as so important that when Congress adjourned after passing it, he hightailed it down to Tennessee to conduct the first removal negotiations with the Chickasaws in Mississippi in person. So, when the textbooks stress the importance of Indian removal to Jackson, they get it exactly right. Whether they get his motives quite right is another matter. And it is important, I think, to state Jackson's position correctly, not to excuse it, but just to see it as it was. Like many other white Americans, Jackson simply assumed that Indian civilization was incompatible with and inferior to his own. He was not, as he is sometimes portrayed, simply a bloodthirsty frontiersman bent on Indian genocide. That caricature is definitely out there. It has, if anything, become stronger within the last few years. It's a caricature. He was not that, but he was no modern racial egalitarian or multiculturalist either. He did not hate all Indians, and I would argue that he did not hate individual Indians any more than he hated everybody else who got in his way. Andrew Jackson was definitely what you might call an equal opportunity hater. He personalized all political disputes. Now, I think it is not true that all political disputes emanated from personal animus. He had some deeply held convictions on some things. But he always personalized his disputes. He did come to hate Chief John Ross, principal chief of the Cherokees, but no more than he hated Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States, or John Quincy Adams, who he had run against twice for president, losing once and then winning once, or Henry Clay, the main leader of the political opposition. And the people he really, if we talk about a class of people rather than individuals, the people he really grew up hating most from childhood were not Indians, but the British. But he did, if he didn't simply hate them, he did patronize and condescend to Indians. Now, all presidents at that time adopted the persona of the great white father in dealing with Indians, but Jackson seemed to especially relish the role. He regarded Indians essentially as children, sometimes merely feckless and irresponsible children, but often violent and recalcitrant children, untutored savages who didn't understand their own best interest and were always in need of governance, direction, and discipline from their white superiors. This shows clearly in the language of that talk to the Creeks, which I mentioned at the beginning of Jackson's administration. And Jackson later had this same talk sent to all the other Indian nations as well. Let me read you a little of this. Friends and brothers, by permission of the Great Spirit above and the voice of the people, I have been made a president of the United States, and now speak to you as your father and friend and request you to listen. Your warriors have known me long. You know I love my white and red children, and always speak straight and not with a forked tongue, that I have always told you the truth. I now speak to you as to my children in the language of truth. Listen. By the way, when I first came across this document, I thought, your white father does not speak with forked tongue? You know, I thought that came out of, you know, the Westerns I used to watch on TV or in the movies in the 1950s. It actually comes from Andrew Jackson. By the way, as some of you know, Jackson was in part using a rhetorical mode that was well established, the great white father bit. And at that time, white people believed that Indians expected to be talked to in this way. More recently, historians have said, no, Indians never actually said they wanted to be talked to in this way. It was whites' fantasy that Indians thought they wanted to be talked to in this way. So Jackson wasn't the first one to use this language, but again, he used it, he reveled in it. So let me continue with this. This is Jackson again. Where you now are, you and my white children are too near to each other to live in harmony and peace. Your game is destroyed, and many of your people will not work until the earth. Beyond the great river Mississippi, your father has provided a country large enough for all of you, and he advises you to remove to it. There, your white brothers will not trouble you. They will have no claim to the land, and you can live upon it, you and all your children, as long as the grass grows or the water runs. In peace and in plenty, it will be yours forever. That's Jackson in 1829. Whether Jackson perceived Indian inferiority as being cultural or racial, that is a matter of upbringing or of genetics, nurture, or nature, is something that, as far as I can see, he never thought about. And quite probably trying to make that distinction between things you're born with and things you acquire, between nurture and nature. If he were alive today and we tried to explain it, he would be simply baffled, as would a lot of people at his time. That's a post-Jacksonian era distinction. Well, as Jackson saw it, Indian nationhood or sovereignty was essentially a fiction. It might have been necessary or useful sometime in the past to deal with Indians just as one would with foreign governments, but that day had long passed. The Indians, this is Jackson's thinking, if they had ever really been independent, clearly were not so any longer. They were in effect public wards, dependents, within and under the government of the United States and of the individual states. Now, back in his years as an Army general, Jackson had protested dealing with Indians through the formal trappings of negotiations and treaties, because doing so, to his mind, clothed the tribes with an independent character, a sovereign character that they didn't really possess. He continued, of course, as president, to follow those same formalities. The treaties that Jackson negotiated were all just like foreign treaties. They had to go to the Senate, be approved by a 2/3 majority. But Jackson's conviction that these formalities weren't really legitimate freed him, I think, in his own mind to use means in negotiating Indian treaties, and those means included coercion, threats, bribery, that he would not have dared to employ, means he would not have dared to employ, nor thought proper to employ, in dealing with people whom he respected as genuinely sovereign and equal. Jackson pulled tricks in negotiating with Indians that he never dared would have tried to pull in negotiating with, say, Britain or France. And really, the justification in his own mind was, and this is a very self-serving justification, these people, they're like children. They don't know what's good for them. I'm going to do what I know is best for them, and I'm going to get them to sign it, and any means I can get them to sign it are justified. Well, these views on Jackson's part pretty much guaranteed that in any direct confrontation between Indian tribes or nations and state governments, Jackson would side with the state governments. The state of Georgia counted on this. In December 1828, Jackson had been elected the month before. He hadn't been inaugurated yet. In December 1828, Georgia, the state legislature of Georgia, passed a law disbanding and outlawing the Cherokee government within the state of Georgia and asserting legal jurisdiction over all of the Cherokee dominion within Georgia, which was most of the northern part of the state. By the way, footnote to the textbook story, this was not a response to the gold rush. Gold rush hadn't happened yet. Nobody knew about the gold. There is, I think, something that induces us to say, oh, it's all about gold. That's simple. You know, it's easy to explain to 8th graders. It's all about the gold. And it happens with the Cherokees, and then it happens with the Black Hills in the Dakotas. This was not about the gold. The discovery of gold on Cherokee land shortly thereafter helped accelerate the building confrontation between Georgia and the Indians. It in no sense was responsible for it. It didn't start it. That confrontation was already far advanced before anybody knew there was any gold. And I see no reason to think that events would not have developed pretty much the way they did, whether there was any gold or not. Mississippi and Alabama, where there wasn't any gold, immediately followed Georgia's lead in 1828. And the same thing played out in Mississippi with the Choctaws and the Chickasaws, as did with Georgia and the Cherokees. Well, Jackson's position was simple. The Indians could retain their tribal governments and their identity and remove west across the Mississippi beyond the boundaries of existing states, where, as we've seen, he told them, the land will be yours forever. Now, we know this, of course, turned out not to be true. The land was all theirs in Oklahoma until the same thing was played out, and they were not forced to remove, but they were reduced to a much smaller reservation than they had originally been given. Whether Jackson knew or suspected that something like that was going to happen, or whether he actually believed that the land would be theirs forever, we'll never know. That was one option that Jackson offered the Indians. The other one would be to disband their governments, submit to state authority where they were, and remain as individuals within Georgia and the other states with whatever rights as citizens those states were willing to allow them. Now, in fact, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi made it plain that if the Indians remained as individuals, they would remain as some subordinate form of people, not without full rights as citizenship. Jackson didn't address that at all. As far as he was concerned, it wasn't his business what states did with their own residents. Well, the Indian Removal Act passed by Congress in 1830 gave Jackson authority and money to implement this policy. The act itself, by the way, was very short. It's amazing if you go back and look at laws in the 19th century, how simple and short they were. Major pieces of legislation today run often hundreds of pages. You can go back and look at something like the Compromise Tariff of 1833 that saved the Union. It's like 2 pages long. The Indian Removal Act was about 2 pages long. That's all. And its actual language was quite innocuous. It authorized the president to lay out districts west of the Mississippi, where there weren't any states yet, to offer those districts west of the Mississippi to the eastern Indians in exchange for their current lands where they were, to pay them for improvements and any property that was immobile and that they couldn't take with them, to pay all the expenses of removal and of subsistence in their new home in the West for the first year, plus all sorts of other benefits. Schools and school teachers, blacksmiths, agricultural implements, a lot of swag This is in all the Indian removal treaties. And along with authorizing this, the Indian Removal Act appropriated $500,000 as a start. If you simply read the text of this law, you might wonder what all the shouting was about, and there was a lot of shouting then and now. The law's wording was permissive. It authorized the president to treat with the Indians and offer them all this stuff. It commanded nothing. It required nothing. Everything it authorized was already legal and was, in fact, already being done, as I've said earlier. Indians were being removed under previous presidents all the time. By the way, by the time Jackson became president, there were already substantial populations of Creeks and Cherokees in the West, in what's now Oklahoma. They had moved years before, not all of them, but some of them. Still, as everyone understood, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was momentous, not for what it said, but for what it signified. And that was that Indian removal was now a top administration priority. Jackson had already announced to Congress his view that the Indians could not, under any circumstances, be allowed to remain as autonomous, self-governing communities within a sovereign state, Georgia, and that for their own good and even for their own survival, they all ought to move. Given the tools at Jackson's command and his willingness to use them, there was little doubt that Jackson would succeed, now that he had congressional imprimatur, would succeed in procuring removal treaties by hook or by crook. What the law allowed, he would in fact compel. And so he did, facing great pressure and no real choice. Over the next few years, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws in Mississippi, the Creeks in Alabama signed treaties agreeing to move west of the Mississippi. The Cherokees, as we all know, held out, and in 1832 they procured the Supreme Court decision of Worcester versus Georgia, affirming their right under previous treaties to stay where they were in Georgia, not only to stay where they were, but to stay as a nation. The Supreme Court in a previous case had called them a dependent domestic nation, but a nation still. To stay within Georgia as a self-governing nation, sovereign community, as the court said, and these are its words, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. The state of Georgia simply ignored the decision. Now, it is true that Jackson knew the state was going to do this. He approved of it doing it. It is not true that Jackson himself defied the decision or refused to enforce it, because he was never called upon through any legal mechanism to enforce it. The United States was not a party to this case. The plaintiff, Samuel Worcester, was a Christian missionary to the Indians who had been arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to hard labor under a Georgia law. He was the plaintiff. Georgia was the defendant. The United States was legally a bystander to the case. And as for that famous quote about John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, meaning I'm not gonna, that quotation is dubious at best. The first time it shows up in any historical record is in, believe it or not, a history of the Civil War written by Horace Greeley and published in 1866. And in that history of the Civil War, Greeley, in passing, said that a former congressman, who by the time Greeley wrote it was dead, had told him that Jackson had said something like this. Greeley didn't even purport himself to be quoting Jackson's exact words. Now, this is not what historians consider generally good evidence, you know. Third-hand testimony showing up in a book published more than 3 decades later. Jackson did, however, genuinely say, we know because we've got the letter where he said it, the decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, which is almost the same thing. Jackson did say in so many words, this decision by the Supreme Court is going to have no effect, it means nothing. What he did not say was, I'm going to defy it, I'm going to refuse to enforce it. What he did, in effect, say and knew was that Georgia's going to ignore it and it's going to have no effect. Why we so often prefer phony quotations to real ones is something that has always perplexed me. That John Marshall line, I checked, it's in every 8th grade textbook I could find. So the Eastern Indians, the Choctaws and the Creeks and the Chickasaws and many others, including finally the Cherokees in 1838 under that sham Treaty of New Echota that Jackson forced on them in 1835, were removed or forcibly expelled. The removal itself became notorious for the privation and the mortality that all of the Indians, not just the Cherokees, suffered along the way. And indeed, there's no question that the mechanics and logistics of the actual removal operation were badly botched from the very beginning. If you look at the treaties themselves, as I said, they made careful and even lavish provision for transportation to the Indians, payment for property they lost or left behind, sustenance along the way, and all kinds of assistance and benefits in getting started in their new homes in the West. Given the coercion that lay behind these treaties, given the powerlessness of most of the Indians to resist, the actual provisions of the treaties were something close to generous. The United States government was in a position, as long as it disregarded what you might think were its own obligations, to dictate to these people. And what it dictated were provisions that included a whole lot of stuff for them. It's kind of an analogy, if you all know, the United States conquered land from Mexico in the Mexican War and then paid Mexico for it, which either makes Americans the most generous or the most hypocritical conquerors ever known. We take it, and then we pay you for it. Yet these promises, all these promises of assistance in the removal treaties were broken time and again. The fact is that once the treaties were signed and removal itself was assured, Jackson, and after him Van Buren, simply lost interest. They cared about getting removal over. They cared about saving money. They cared about getting it done cheap and getting it done quick. They didn't care about getting it done right. Jackson did not order or approve the failings and disasters of the removal operation, but he also did nothing effectual to prevent him. He simply took no notice. And we've encountered this in the Jackson papers. Already by the early 1830s, with the first removals of the Choctaws, reports are coming back that the logistics are completely collapsing. You know, the transportation isn't there, the food isn't there, the clothing isn't there, there's nothing there. And Jackson simply paid no attention to this at all, paid no attention. And I think you can say that it is hard to conceive that Jackson would have shown such indifference if the people out there dying had been white. So this, I think, is one thing for which Jackson can be unreservedly condemned. And yet it also raises an awkward question. What exactly disturbs us about Indian removal? Is it the policy or is it the way it was implemented? Because it is, of course, quite possible for a well-intentioned, benign policy to be botched in the implementation. To put it directly, and this is an uneasy question, would the Trail of Tears still bother us if nobody died on it? If the Cherokees and all the others arrived safe and sound in Oklahoma, hale and hearty, if the government lived up to its promises of all the help it would give them, would we still regard Indian removal as a great stain on Andrew Jackson's reputation and on the country's? Well, Jackson and Van Buren actually proclaimed Indian removal to be a great success. And interestingly, some contemporary critics and historians later who condemned Jackson on all other policy grounds said, well, the one thing he did that was a great success was Indian removal. It wasn't until the 20th century, wasn't until late in the 20th century that most historians came to condemn Indian removal. As Jackson argued to Congress, and what I'm about to tell you is Jackson's own justification, which I think was absolutely sincere and completely self-serving. He was doing the Indians a favor. He was moving them out of harm's way, saving them from the fate of, and Jackson named these in messages to Congress, the Pequots, the Mohicans, the Narragansetts, Indian nations that earlier in American history had not removed and had simply been erased from the face of the earth. Jackson's leading critics were up in New England, by the way, and Jackson, with some rhetorical force, turned to them and said in so many words, "You now criticize my policy as being inhumane and unchristian and dishonest. Where are your Indians? You killed them all." You killed them all back in the 1600s and 1700s, which, by the way, was largely true. As for the Indians, this is Jackson talking, having to abandon their familiar homes for a strange country far away, well, Europeans coming to America did that. White Americans moving westward did that all the time, and they didn't have a generous government helping them out and paying their way. Nobody felt sorry for them. But the bottom line, said Jackson, was this: which would you rather have? And these are Jackson's words: a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages, or our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. Now, I am not defending the validity of Jackson's arguments, which were, again, clearly self-serving, nor the accuracy of his facts. For instance, that baldly false description of the Cherokee country as covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages. As many historians have pointed out, the Cherokees had so far assimilated, many of them, the norms of white society, that some of them had large cotton plantations with big houses and lots of slaves. But whether or not we like his answer, Jackson did pose an awkward but essential question, which it's easy to gloss over by blaming a villain. And that essential question is, what, in the whole great scheme of Indian and Euro-American interaction on the North American continent, what were the alternatives? What was or should have been the ultimate end in view? If Indian removal was wrong, which I think almost everybody today says it was, including me, what would have been right? What other solution was there? And it's telling in this context to look at the arguments of Jackson's contemporary white critics. There were many of these. They had powerful voices. Jackson's policy was by no means consensual. You cannot excuse Jackson on the grounds of, well, everybody at the time thought this. No, they didn't. Ordinary citizens, including for the first time large numbers of women, deluged Congress with petitions against the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which passed the House of Representatives with all of Jackson's full muscle behind it. That Indian Removal Act passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 102 to 97. 102 to 97. Switch 3 congressmen's votes and it would have gone down. The critics savaged Jackson's policy as hypocritical, dishonest, dishonorable, immoral, and unchristian. And they backed these charges not only with impassioned rhetoric, but with meticulous and persuasive documentation, including republishing for instance, all of the 15 treaties that the Cherokees had previously signed with the United States government, all of which guarantee their right to stay where they are forever, in Georgia. Well, the writings of Jackson's critics make powerful reading even today. And yet, what alternative did they offer? The most eloquent and thorough of Jackson's critics was a Christian publicist named Jeremiah Everts, who wrote a widely circulated book-length series of essays under the pseudonym of William Penn. And Everts condemned Jackson up and down, and yet he himself did not doubt that removal was in the Indians' own best interests, provided it was removal in their own good time, on terms of their choosing, and by their own free consent. Jackson's predecessor as president, John Quincy Adams, had defended the Cherokees against Georgia, and he savaged Jackson for abandoning them. But the only alternative he ever offered, Adams, was a kinder and gentler removal, one driven by the natural unfolding of circumstances rather than the impatient greed of grasping frontiersmen and the impudence of state governments and the machinations of evil-disposed presidents. Adams's solution to the problem was, let the Indians stay where they were, and soon they will see that they need to remove. In short, had Jackson never been president, or never even lived, the question of how Indian and Euro-American or white civilizations could coexist on one landmass and under one polity would still have been there. It's still there. I lived for many years in New Mexico. That problem, that contradiction of how you can have sovereign Indian nations within sovereign states under a sovereign United States, that contradiction has never been resolved. It is simply managed. It is managed day by day. No simple solution has ever been found. And to my mind, that's what gives this problem a truly tragic dimension. Tragic in the classic sense of the word, not the sense in which a car accident is a tragedy, but in the old-fashioned Greek sense of the word. Not just that this problem was not satisfactorily resolved, but that it's difficult to conceive what a satisfactory solution would look like. We can look back at, say, slavery, and say how much better it would have been. Might have been all different, Jack, to quote All the King's Men. Would have been all different if southern states had gone ahead and abolished slavery in the wake of the American Revolution, as at the time it seemed there was a glimmer of hope that they might have done. You can look back and say it's slavery and say, if only that had happened, we might still have a race problem, but we wouldn't have had a civil war over slavery. We can look back at Indian removal and say how much better it would have been if what? If the Cherokees and the others had never been forced out, we're still there today. How different would the United States be today? And is that difference something that you and I and all other Americans, standing as I presume we are right now on what was once Indian land, and I know that when I speak on this subject in Tennessee, I am speaking on what was once Cherokee land. Is that something we would be willing to accept? If not, then do we, all of us, Americans as a whole, you and me, as the ultimate beneficiaries and legatees of Indian removal, do we owe some penance to its victims or recompense to their descendants? Those are troubling questions. I can't say that I have the answers to them. But I will say that blaming Andrew Jackson, blameworthy though he may be, cannot relieve the rest of us from responsibility for asking those questions and for trying to find some answers. Thank you very much.